Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Panels, where we talk about my webcomic, Simon Sue's, amongst other things around the creative process. And I am joined today by the usual crew.
Hello, I'm Corey. I'm a character artist and cookie addict.
I am Shannon, and I am a photographer about town.
Alrighty. So today we have the latest episode of my webcomic, Simon Sue's, which is episode 64. And for those of you who have not seen the previous videos or not read the previous episodes, this is time for a bit that I call Previously On. Okay, so in this bit, what I like to do is just go over what has happened in the immediate past so that everyone is on the same page. And when we talk about the current episode, people kind of have an understanding of what has been going on so far with the characters. So in episode 63, what we discovered was that Montague, who is kind of a little bit of Simon's arch nemesis, he's sort of screwed him over in the past by giving really bad advice, really bad legal advice, is about to give this press conference in front of the courtroom steps. And Simon decides that he's going to try to get a little revenge in and humiliate Montague in front of all of these reporters. Unfortunately, while he does get a little bit of his own, a little bit of hits in there, he doesn't realize that Montague is in cahoots with the Eight Eyes demon, who is now taken on the form of this female attorney and has joined Montague's defense team. So while he is trying to kind of poke the bear with Montague, she shows up and completely outclasses Simon to the point that she just drives him out of the press conference, and she pursues him to torment him even more. But then he gets this double whammy where he discovers that Fred, who is his former professor slash mentor slash secret lover, has also been persuaded to join the defense team. And this is something that he's been blindsided with because he's been sort of putting off their relationship for a while to deal with a lot of this occult stuff. And instead of just cutting it off, he's been sort of stringing her along, and then this is the fruition of kind of his thoughtlessness. And Isaac has decided to take the opportunity to revisit the conversation that they had from the beginning of season 2, where he offered him the law or access to these occult laws in exchange for an unnamed favor. And that is where we are now. So today I want to try something a little bit different. So normally what we do is we go from the beginning of the episode to the end, and we scroll through and just talk about whatever comes to mind. Here, what I'd like to do, and what I thought might be fun, is if we pick a particular aspect of the episode or the comic that we find very interesting or was unique for this particular part of the story, and do a little bit of a deeper dive. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the idea of revising and continually editing and honing something until you get into a state that you're happy with. I think that this part of the narrative, or this particular episode, is super monumental. I would say that almost the entire series has been building to this moment, and we're really hitting the rising action of the season, and I would say the series. So we, spoiler alert, are now about to hear the backstory of one of the main characters that's been pretty much a mystery up to this point. It's the little boy, the demonic boy, who is named Isaac, we discover. And because it's so important, I thought about this a lot, and I like to kind of put out a first draft, send it to my editor, send it around to just get people's initial feedback, and then I will wait on it for a couple of days and then come back, reread the episode, and see where I might have missed things or had some blind spots when I first created it. And I did that quite a lot for this particular file or this particular chapter, which led to many, many revisions. It was very painful, a lot of work. This took more time and effort than any of the other chapters in the series. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about what got taken away, what got added, why I made those changes. So first of all, and again, a lot of spoilers, there's the moment here in the beginning with his brother. And because this brother, Jonathan, we kind of have allusions to him earlier on in earlier episodes, but we never really know what he's about. And so I had to get people to feel empathy for him or to, dig this relationship between the two of them very fast. And in the beginning, I was just, honestly, I was like, I need to get this chapter done. And what is the most expedient way to show, what the audience, the bare minimum the audience needs to know. But as usual, as I read the comic before or afterward over and over again, I start picking up on more sort of storytelling misses. And I definitely was missing some type of scene where it solidified their relationship. And so I ended up adding this whole sequence in here where they're kind of fighting and kind of nagging each other, which is almost mirroring the relationship that he has with Simon, where they're on each other's cases, and he's very snippy. So I was like, he would have the same sort of personality or relationship with his brother that he would have with Simon, who maybe he considers an older brother. So I added this sequence where the brother is kind of acting like a protector, because he knows that Isaac has what he considers maybe an illness of some kind, or he is hearing voices in his head. So maybe he is afraid that he will be pegged as bewitched, or maybe a devil child.
Touched in the brain.
He's touched in the brain. So he's warning him here to, keep it to himself, and that he can only be honest with him. But all the while, I did want to give little hints as to, some of the brotherly little affectations that they have. So, name calling. I did like that at the end here. Again, he crumples his hair or frumps his hair, similar to what Simon has done in the past. But also here he says, basically the boogeyman is going to get you. So just have this very lighthearted conversation to make it seem like they are very affectionate with each other. Yeah. So I added that part. And then we're going to skip ahead to, here, this is another bunch of sequences that I had to sort of splice in later, because I realized that I wanted to make this very creepy feeling. And in the beginning, a lot of this stuff was Isaac just narrating. And in the original version, he says, there was a winter that came, and it was very unnatural, and he's alluding to the fact that it caused a lot of deaths, but you don't actually see that visually. So I wanted to add a sequence, or I wanted to add some panels where it actually shows the effect of this unnatural sickness or plague that's come into the village. And that's where I added this scene with the gravestones. I also added this bit where I originally had the panel of just the grave by itself, and then I cut to an interior shot, but I wanted to slow this down a little bit. So I added a panel where he stops and actually takes a look at the gravestone and reacts to it to give an indication.
It also gives the year, which...
Yeah, so I wanted to subtly give some more information about the setting. and the fact that this could be somebody that's important to him, and that's why he stopped.
Now, can I ask, like, amongst your challenges was getting the correct sort of design for the, because looking at the what's on the tombstone, this doesn't look like a modern tombstone. Did you research what would have been on a headstone, I should say, at the time?
Oh, I did. I found this interesting paper, and now I can't remember the name of the author, but they basically were talking about the types of writing or the types of material even that you would see in tombstones in the 17th century in the New World. So particularly Dutch colonies. And a lot of times they would just use really cheap stone slabs or even tree bark. And that's why it's been really hard to find out exactly if they did have headstones at that time, because the tree would get destroyed or relocated, or it would what's the term? It would break down or disintegrate. So they didn't have a lot of evidence of whether there were markers and then what the markers said, but they were able to locate. I think it was actually in, I want to say New York, either New York or kind of like the border of Massachusetts and New York, where they did uncover a bunch of these gravestones, and they discovered that they would, use a lot of abbreviations, and the anno actually means like the year of the person's birth. An obit is the year of their death, and then the acronym at the bottom is like basically in the year of our Lord, or like I'm trying to remember, but it's an acronym for basically like they rest in peace. And another interesting thing is that the women would have their maiden names in the gravestone.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So you only got your maiden name back after you were dead?
So I don't know if it was a way to be able
Never
to
name
trace the
back.
person's lineage, but that was particular to Dutch colonies, and not any other sort of burial site.
So what you're saying is that there are probably a lot of unmarked Dutch graves in the so-called New World East Coast because they've all worn away. That's what I'm hearing.
I can confirm that because not that far from, I think, what used to be my middle high school, there was actually a grave. And you saw some of the headstones that were there, but they were mainly like the ones that were left over were from the wealthy people, but the rest was like field. And they were like, "Oh, well, this guy used to live here," and I was like, "Well, where's this? Where's his tombstone?" They're like, "We don't know. We don't really know where exactly or which plot they're actually buried in. We just have this old map here that was like tattered and torn." And I was like, "Well, that's disgusting and useless."
Wow.
Okay, so I'm gonna actually skip to the very, very end, because this was actually something, this sequence here, I had originally planned to do when I wrote out the script for the chapter, and I cut it because I thought that it was unnecessary, or it was something that would take too long, basically.
Okay.
As I go through them, I'm like, oh, I start getting very economic about the panels, and I'm like, well, do I really need this? Let me edit this out. And then I will change my mind as I reread the chapter over and over again, and I read for more for I guess the emotional beats, where when I first do them, it's kind of like the narrative beats. And then as and the narrative beats and the pacing, and as I start feeling the pacing is getting there, and I know that I've I've gone through the plot points that I need to, then I'm like, have I told this as powerful as it could be, or is it as emotionally impactful as it could be? And then that's when I start adding in more panels and
Hmm.
mostly the panels that I've cut.
I could say that you definitely changed the mood because I don't remember exactly everything from the last one that I read from you before, but I do remember it was creepy. It's kind of creepy, but it was only like a hint of it, and then you like went on to the rest of the chapter. But this one, not only is it like creepy, but it's kind of scary too.
I think it's because when you have somebody narrate something to you, it's almost making you detached from the events of the story,
Mm.
whereas this is present, and so you feel more immersed in the action, and I think that makes it more creepy or more threatening. But what got added was this
That part's
escape from
creepy.
the village. So we at this point we know that there's some type of sacrifice that has to be made, and the families in this village are offering up their children, or maybe another family member, or maybe a servant in their care. It just has to be somebody. Every family has to offer up an individual, and in Isaac's case, it's him. But the brother has decided that he's going to go against the rule of the village and help sneak his brother out of there. And originally, again, it was just all narrated, and I kind of cut to them already out of the village and not actually showing the escape. But I wanted to give a little bit more information about what the predicament is, and then show a little bit more the desperation of the brother and what lengths he goes to protect Isaac.
And also what lengths the villagers are going to. Like that one scene in particular of the man holding the axe, and in the background you can see his presumed wife bundling up the little girl. You're like, oh yeah, that right there. It's horrible, but it's so necessary, and I'm so glad that it's there, because it definitely contributes to kind of
How bad it is.
Yeah.
yeah, how bad it is, the horror of this whole situation. Yeah.
Two things that kind of inspired me. One was
Your childhood. No, I'm kidding.
oh no. Well, that would be, oh man. Little did you know that I grew up in some like Dutch religious colony.
Where they
And
used to
You're like,
offer up children.
I
little did you
escaped.
know, I'm 400 years old.
Well, it was all these documentaries that I was watching on the Donner Party,
Mm.
and
Oh.
then two, The Witch, actually, which if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend for all of the audience out there. Definitely take a look at that movie. I think it was it Edgar Edgers. I'm mispronouncing it, but I think it was his first film.
Same director as The Lighthouse.
Same director as The Lighthouse,
Sure.
but he does a magnificent job of portraying isolation and oppression and just sheer terror. And I was super inspired by that. It also, takes place in a similar era. So I was like, I really want to show how desperate these people are, how isolated Isaac and his brother are. So it's not like they can just go to a city and escape. They're in the middle of this valley in the middle of nowhere during a terrible, unnatural winter storm.
That guy's got some creepy
Yeah.
eyes. He definitely looks like he's got the devil in him.
So this whole sequence was not in the original version, and it took some time, but I feel like it adds to the relationship to the brothers, it adds to the atmosphere, and it just lends more to, I don't know, the importance of his story, of Isaac's story, and
Well,
what
it's
he
all
went through.
yeah, it's also too that like you said that you needed to have the audience sympathize with Isaac now, and so now to see Isaac in the position of needing to be protected and definitely out of his depth and having to have someone else come in and help him out like his older brother. It's
Hmm.
the opposite of what we've seen so far, because up until now, Isaac has been this sort of physically a child, but definitely the one who's saved Simon several
Yeah.
times.
No, that's a good point. He has been kind of in the position of power in their dynamic, and at least in Simon and Isaac's dynamic. So it's definitely reversed in this case. Oh, the other thing is I just love drawing scenes against a winter background. It's just so minimalist, and it's really, you can get some nice like silhouettes and negative space. These guys are creepy.
Step back or I'll shoot thee.
Yeah. So yeah, those are some of the scenes that got added that I think it made the episode in general stronger.
So for my piece, I actually wanted to discuss, Myung, what you have done with this comic, both in terms of research and using
What you have
visuals.
done sounds like I
Done what you
committed a
have
crime.
done.
Dun, dun,
Yeah,
dun.
what you have done with these rotten cows.
How dare you?
Basically, like, what are some of the methods you've used to set this particular chapter apart in terms of time
Mm,
and, like, yeah, so indicators as to the historical period that we are in, but also visual indicators that separate it out from the rest of the comic. So
hmm.
that is actually what I wanted to talk about, and I thought it was a nice segue that you had mentioned winter backgrounds, as being so fun to kind of create horror scenes in, because that got me thinking
Yes.
about horror movies in general and how so many of them do feature like famous or just piles and piles of snow. And the first two I thought of were The Shining and
Mm-hmm.
The Thing with Kurt Russell.
Oh, yes. um, there is another one that I thought of, but it's kind of just a few scenes, and it's such a like not obscure movie, but it's not something that you usually call out. I was thinking of Hannibal,
Oh,
not
yeah.
Hannibal. There's what do you call it? There, it's the movie about him as a youth, like him growing up.
A young person.
Yeah, I can't remember what the name of it was called.
I
Lots of
think it was,
screaming. I just remember there being lots of screaming in that
oh,
video,
maybe it
in
But
that
was young
movie.
Hannibal, like young.
but you know the story, his backstory.
Yeah.
So he was, I think it's Lithuania.
Hmm.
His family was from Lithuania, and during the war, they were hiding out in this cabin in the winter, and these soldiers come, and the parents die in a some type of explosion, or I think some type of grenade or ammunition goes off, and these soldiers find them, and it's just the Hannibal and his little sister Misha, and they end up cooking her
Hmm.
because they're starving, and it's in the middle of winter, and they're hiding out because I think they're deserters. So there's a scene where he manages to escape them, and he runs out into the winter, this winter wasteland, and there's a forest behind him, and it's just him, this in this dark garb, rags, and he's just walking across the snow before he gets encountered by the Alliance, or not the Alliance, the Allies. I'm thinking of World of Warcraft. But
Funny line.
but it's like this really wide shot of him against this white background, and it's just utterly devastating. I love winter shots like that.
Hmm.
Sleepy Hollow too, during the flashback with the two little girls where they find
Yes,
the Hessian.
I thought of that as well. And I think just like snow and horror are two just friends forever. For
Yeah,
real world circumstances, I keep thinking of like the story of Dyatlov Pass. Um, do you guys know what
that
that
sounds
story?
familiar. Is
It
that the
was,
Mm-mm.
hikers that?
yeah, the hikers in.
I've never heard of this.
It was a group of hikers in, what was it, the 50s or 60s?
Yeah, and it's completely unsolved. They have no idea how there was one survivor, right?
Oh, is this the one in Russia?
Yeah, where they all they
Oh, yeah.
disappeared, or they were found, but they were died under very mysterious
And
circumstances.
some say it was poison,
Mhm.
some are think it was a wild animal.
They actually released, there was a news story about a week ago where they were like the snow animators for the movie Frozen worked in conjunction with this guy who wanted a model of what the snow potentially could have been like at Dyatlov Pass at this time.
Oh my
And
god.
from that, they felt like they reached the conclusion that it was definitively an avalanche, but a small one that could conceivably explain the types of injuries that these kids got. But anyway, I thought like that was such a great choice as well for this particular chapter because reading through this, I made the assumption that Simon Sue's as a comic that for the most part seems to be heavy emphasis on black and red
Hmm.
as the color palette, or even like
That
black and blue with some scenes, but overall black and red is the color palette, to switch to this different time and in a way to Isaac's story instead, setting it in this winter backdrop and also doing things like including these cool toned shadows really presents it, you really feel like you're in a different time, you're in a different place, you're in Isaac's story instead. So I really appreciated that. I don't know if that was like another part of the choice.
Well, I very much appreciate you for
Oh,
for calling that out because I actually I do have a set of filters that I use repeatedly to try to keep consistent with what part of the narrative you're looking at. So I put a filter on flashbacks that the character is retelling for informational purposes. So it's kind of like the sepia
mm,
filter, and then when it's more of an emotional flashback where it doesn't necessarily tell the facts of the story, but it's more like what the person was feeling at the time. I'll
mm,
have a sort of desaturated with a film grain that I put on top. And for this one, where it was kind of like a brand new type of flashback, where it was a little bit of both. It was the character, or you were sometimes present in the scene, and then sometimes the character, like Isaac, would do the voiceover. So I really wanted it to feel like a dream, and I ended up putting these two filters on that sort of blew out the color. Not quite bloom, but it was like a desaturated brightness contrast adjustment layer on
mm.
everything.
Well, it works.
Thank you.
I like it. And if we talk about sort of visually setting this chapter apart, the choice in depicting text bubbles this time around, we're still getting that blue, black, white palette, but this is just like it looks like the demonic Jackson Pollock of a speech bubble with like if he had also stolen like the the Declaration of Independence because that's what this font reminds me of too. So I thought I just love the look of these speech bubbles, or not speech bubbles, even like narrative bubbles. What would you
Mhm.
call this? Um,
um yeah, I think narrative bubble is actually a good description.
these they look like ink. This is what it, and there's something so menacing about it because even in some of these sort of a little bit more desaturated layers in the back, I can almost imagine this is some sort of clawed crustacean arachnid. Like, what are these textures in the
It's
background?
chaotic ink.
This took a really long time to figure out, and this is also another thing that was not in the original, and it was just again him just saying that he hears stuff, and I'm like, I need a way to visually show what's in his head. How do you show madness, basically?
Oh, I had wondered about like I imagine the words. I don't know yet, but one of my guesses is that maybe he's actually hearing demonic voices for some reason. But it's interesting to think if that were true because this is not at all how we've seen demonic words portrayed visually so far. So I don't know if that's true, but that's just my commentary right now.
Mhm.
Without giving anything away, there it's a little of both. So there's something that is going on inside his head that may originate within or may originate externally. We don't know yet, but this is, still it's inside of his head, and he's experiencing it, and no one else is. So it feels like he's going insane.
Hmm. Okay, so to that, I have another question for you, Myung, which is it a coincidence that these flecks of ink and are
Rorschach.
no, but very visually reminiscent of Isaac when he uses his so-called dark gifts?
Oh,
Because when he uses his dark gifts, it almost looks like this black lightning.
yes. Actually, it has. That was a little bit tricky because the filter or the blend modes that I use for that do not show up well against white.
Oh.
And actually, you can, if you scroll back up to the mountains, you can see a little bit of it there. So there's that blue
Hmm.
glow. That's actually what I use on his ability, his dark gift. But as it got to the winter and the snow, like you can't see the overlay anymore.
Mm.
And I couldn't find a right mode that would have the same sort of like a seamless glow that would happen against a dark background and a white background.
I would be very interested in seeing an in-depth kind of constructing the panel. Like, what were the pieces of putting this visual concept together? Um, yeah. There's also something I just personally, in 2D art, when I see things that are reminiscent of more 3D, there's something so unsettling about it to me. Like, I'm always really weirded out when I see things like that. Um,
Oh,
I
that's so this reminded you more of 3D?
or things that are like of a different format because you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like Courage the Cowardly Dog or whatever that show is used to do this a lot. But
I
these look
think
very like I could reach out and grab this, like this belongs in the material world in a way that this is obviously a comic.
actually, what I was thinking was kind of almost a little bit of the reverse, where the characters are they're not 3D realistic, but they do have a sense of like dimensionality to them.
Hmm.
But this effect here, this bubble, is very graphic.
This is somewhat of a tangent. And just a bit of a random question that I have for you before I move on to my last question, which is about research for the chapter. But a little bit above, we have this scene where it's a windmill, but and then a fence, but it's of the side as though we were going to turn our phones and look at it the other way. And I think this is the first panel I've seen like this in Simon Sue's thus far. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like it took me a moment almost when I got to this point because I was so used to thinking vertically that it took my brain a second to register that I was actually looking at a landscape panel put in vertically. And I well really just wanted to know real quick, like what was the like what
Ah,
sets this one apart or this
there I rarely do something that's like this extreme where it is almost completely rotated 90 degrees. There is one other time, and it was, I don't remember the episode with the professor and the spider demon,
yeah.
where the spider is like crawling up the wall and crawling around the room. That was completely vertical.
Oh.
But generally, this is like my version of the Dutch angle.
I see.
So whenever I want it to feel like things are just completely off kilter or topsy turvy, unnatural. Like I will do this,
Okay. Yeah, well,
or
it definitely
or
felt unnatural. Like I was, because at first I was like, "What is this spider creature?" And then I realized, "Oh, it's a windmill." Well, I don't know that I feel better now because my
yeah,
first
it's
instinct was, "This is a spider."
The
you
broken
definitely
fence.
yeah, you definitely have to be careful with because you're throwing people's equilibrium off. So it has to have very distinct landmarks so that you can get your bearing. But when you do that, I think that it does give you that feeling of unease.
Hmm.
Plus, it also does that pacing thing where you're scrolling across this. Now you can really do an extreme wide.
Okay, that answers that question. So I will continue on to my next question, which really is another way that you're setting this period apart, and that's doing the research on the history fun times. Um, I love the hat, by the way. I just want to say it's a really good hat, but also like crafting language that could have been used at the time, because that's something that some people like. It's like when you don't get it, it can just sound ridiculous. So I imagine this was very hard to do because it sounds really good. Even some of the slang, like mucky smelt wort. I was like, was that a thing from the time? Also, when are you supposed to use ye versus thee? I was like, is there a rule behind this?
There are, and I actually learned my lesson because in the original version of the comic, many moons ago, Isaac talked like this all the
The
time.
whole time.
Oh my god.
Not necessarily like in front of strangers, but when it was just him and Simon, or when it was somebody that he didn't have to put on a pretense,
Sarah.
he would say this. And after I did it, I was like, one, this is exhausting. Two, it's really hard to get a good dialogue going with between him and Simon because it just didn't feel natural. And then three, I was using there's thee and thine and thy, um, thou. Those all have rules that, like at the time, I was just going off of, in high school where you read Shakespeare and
Yeah,
and
you just
you're
yeah.
just like, oh, I'll just throw in a thou, thou art thou, or something like that. But it actually, so I want, when you have something that begins with a vowel, you have to use thee, I think, instead of thou.
Oh, is that it?
It's rules like that, and
Wait,
now
okay, so thy eyes. Oh, no, no, no. Ye tumble. Now I need to find
and then there's rules of
where
like when, if it's like something, a pronoun and at the end of a sentence or the beginning of a sentence.
it's much more complicated than I thought. Okay.
And sometimes I'm just like, that doesn't sound right, and I'll fudge it. And then sometimes I'll try to adhere to actual grammar of the times.
Mhm.
And then some of the insults, I actually, just looked up some Shakespeare insults since he was the master of abrasion, basically.
Mhm. Okay. I was trying to see if I could find that example of thou, but anyway. Well, how does that then what about the clothing? Because there's some wonderful outfits in this chapter, especially represented by older brother John.
So he's a little
Clothing
bit of
are
a
Dutch.
hybrid.
Actually, Corinne, your character from the process episode looks like a super battle version of John in some ways.
That's fair. I
Yeah.
mean, um, I guess mine's a little bit older than John. I say
Mhm.
mine was like more in the 1400s.
Okay.
Well, the brother definitely has stylish,
He does.
a
He's
super
rich.
stylish coat going on here, but it was a little bit of a hybrid because this is supposed to take place in the 1600s, and I was just looking at a lot of images or fashions of pilgrims and Dutch colonies. I can't remember. It was the there was a sect of Quakers that I was looking at, New Dutch, but I was like, oh well, everyone is in black. It looks kind of, it's a little bit drab, or it's for the villagers that makes sense because they can kind of sort of fall in the background. But for the brother, I wanted him to stand out and be a visually attractive character. So I sort of tailored his coat to be a little bit more modern, anime-ish. And then actual, 16th century or 1600s.
You have like a little pamphlet that's like, okay, how to make
Vampire Hunter D.
Right there. So I'm looking at the concept. I want to say my guy actually is younger than her design from the looks of it, since he doesn't have little pantaloons on. He actually has pants and chaps on.
Okay.
With the Dutch hair.
Yeah, or you know how Game of Thrones, the costume design on that is amazing.
Hybrid.
Yeah, they will throw in some sort of Asian influences, samurai influences into something like the Lannister armor. But for the most part, it's supposed to take place in, like during the War of the Roses, so in like the 1400s. But you'll see it's like plated, almost wicker armor on some of the main characters when they're going into battle, and it just looks really cool. And that's it for today's episode of Behind the Panels. Thank you all again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to be able to provide this type of content. Before we go, I just want to give a quick shout out to a few of my patrons on Patreon. Thank you, Anna J. Henderson, Ash S. Reckless, Dark Box, and HJ Shuttleworth. As always, you guys rock. I'm so thankful and grateful for your support. Again, till next time on Behind the Panels.